Tom and Jerry, Home Depot flood. Introduction. Hello and welcome to another Tom and Jerry story. This is about a flood happening at a Home Depot. Main characters. Grandma is an elderly lady. Thomas and Killer are Grandma's pets. Thomas is Grandma's misbehaving cat. Killer is Grandma's loyal bulldog. Jerry is the little mouse who escapes Thomas every time. Butch is a misbehaving cat and best friends with Thomas. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful August afternoon in Utica, New York. Grandma is outside in the backyard of their house. She is making final plans for a construction project for a garden shed as a storage place for unused items she owns. A few minutes later Grandma knows she needs screws, tie plates, bolts, washers, nails, lumber for walls, concrete for structure, mesh wiring, rubber for scaffolding, and several power tools. A few seconds later Thomas says it is very hot outside. Grandma then tells Thomas to stop complaining. A few seconds later Grandma jots down her list of things she needs. 5 minutes later Thomas and Grandma speed off to a Home Depot. 30 minutes later Grandma grabs a cart. 1 second later Grandma disappears. A few seconds later Thomas pushes a cart towards the paint aisles. 12 seconds later Thomas starts placing all gallons of paint into his cart. 3 minutes later Thomas placed 74 gallons of paint into his cart. 1 second later Thomas walks away with his cart. A few minutes later Grandma spots Thomas. 1 second later she sees his cart. 1 second later Thomas pushes his cart over, making an ocean of paint. 1 second later Thomas speeds away. A few seconds later Grandma runs after Thomas with her cart. 2 minutes later Grandma grounds Thomas for 2 weeks. Thomas then gets very angry. 1 second later Thomas storms off. 2 minutes later Thomas arrives at a hose for the garden section. A minute later Thomas turns it on. A few seconds later Thomas finds a wall of spigots. A few seconds later Thomas starts to turn them on. 1 second later water starts to fly out of them all. 1 second later Thomas runs for his life. A minute later Grandma hears water. 1 second later water starts to flood her shoes. A few seconds later Grandma runs for her life. A few minutes later Grandma finds Thomas at the Ferrari. 1 minute later they speed home, with the news on about the Home Depot flood. A few seconds later the radio says today a flood happened at the Home Depot. 16 people have drowned. It is confirmed that the Home Depot will be torn down as a result of this flood. No person was responsible for this. It was a grey-skinned cat with yellow eyes, green irises, white paws, white patch of fur at the end of their tail, whiskers, white fur around their mouth, light pink ears, black eyebrows, and a light grey patch of skin on their chest area. If you see this cat, please give them a brutal punishment day. That is all for now. Grandma then slams on the accelerator. 3 minutes later Grandma parks the Ferrari in front of her house. 1 second later Grandma asks Thomas what he did after pushing the paint over. Thomas proudly says he flooded the Home Depot. Grandma then picks up Thomas. A few seconds later Grandma tells Thomas he is getting a brutal life-threatening punishment day. Thomas gulps with fear. 1 second later Grandma says there will be 12 punishments that will start out painless and get more painful and destructive as they go on. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later Thomas is dragged into the house against his will. 2 minutes later Grandma says the punishments. Grandma says the first punishment is that your blanket will be ripped apart. Punishment 2 is an arm slap. Third punishment will be an Xbox fire. Punishment 4 is a downstairs region kick. 5th is a TV fire. 6 is a BB gun to the behind. 7 is a dry ice and liquid nitrogen bath. 8 you will be driven over with my Ferrari at 100 miles per hour. 9 you will be forced to hug a cactus. 10 you will be thrown into a pit of black widow spiders. 11 is you be cliff jumping with no equipment. Finally, punishment 12 is you will be launched into space with no spacesuit. Thomas screams with pure anger. 3 seconds later Grandma rips Thomas's blanket in half. A few seconds later Grandma slaps Thomas while grabbing his Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma walks downstairs with the Xbox. A few seconds later Grandma grabs a flamethrower. 1 minute later the Xbox is put up in flames. A few seconds later Grandma kicks Thomas's nether region with all her might. 1 second later Thomas crashes onto asphalt. 2 minutes later Thomas's bedroom TV is ablaze. A few seconds later Grandma shoots Thomas's rear end with her BB gun. 1 minute later Grandma starts setting up Thomas's bath. 10 minutes later Thomas gets pushed into the bathtub. 5 minutes later Grandma drags Thomas outside against his will. A few minutes later Grandma runs over Thomas at over 120 miles per hour. A few seconds later Thomas crashes onto the roof of the house. 2 minutes later Thomas and Grandma drive off to a desert. 10 minutes later Thomas hugs a cactus. A few minutes later they drive off to Florida. An hour later they arrive at the tallest cliff in Vermont for punishment 11. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas are flown up to the peak. A few minutes later Thomas is thrown off the peak of the cliff. 5 minutes later Thomas and Grandma drive off to Florida. 18 hours later Grandma and Thomas arrive at the Everglades. An hour later Thomas is thrown into a pit of black widows. A few minutes later Grandma and Thomas speed off to NASA's John F. Kennedy Space Center. 20 minutes later Grandma parks the Ferrari. A few minutes later Grandma is fitted for a spacesuit. An hour later the shuttle is ready. A few minutes later Thomas and Grandma board the shuttle with Shannon Walker and Andrew R. Morgan. An hour later the shuttle blasts off. 20 minutes later Thomas is thrown out of the shuttle with a spacesuit. A few minutes later Thomas's spacesuit helmet visor remotely opens. Half a second later, Thomas explodes and ceases to exist. A few hours later, the shuttle lands and is broadcasted nationwide. Soon, Grandma drives home to live her days out with a new cat named Lightning. The end. Conclusion. Hello there. I hope you enjoyed this Tom and Jerry story. Inspiration is from one of those weird Kayla Gets Grounded videos. More stories to come. Bye for now.